In the city of Ashwood, where the streets were lined with oak trees, and the houses seemed to touch the sky, there lived a man named Julian St. Clair. Julian was a man of great power and influence, with a smile that could charm the birds from the trees, and a wallet that could buy him anything he desired. He was a judge, respected and feared by all who knew him. But beneath the surface of Julian's polished exterior, a different story was unfolding. A story of corruption, greed, and deceit. A story that would ultimately lead to his downfall. It began with small things. A bribe here, a favor there. Julian justified it to himself as a necessary part of doing business. But as time went on, the bribes grew larger, and the favors more sinister. Julian became embroiled in a web of corruption that threatened to consume him whole. Despite his questionable actions, Julian's career continued to soar. He was appointed to the highest court in the land, and his name became synonymous with power and prestige. But there were those who suspected that something was not quite right. A small group of journalists, led by a determined young woman named Sarah, began to investigate Julian's dealings. As Sarah dug deeper, she uncovered a trail of evidence that led her to a shocking conclusion. Julian St. Clair, the respected judge, was not what he seemed. He was a corrupt official, using his power and influence to line his own pockets and further his own interests. But Sarah's investigation was not without its risks. As she got closer to the truth, she began to receive threatening messages and warnings to back off. Julian's influence reached far and wide, and he would stop at nothing to protect his reputation. Despite the danger, Sarah refused to give up. She was driven by a desire for justice and a need to expose the truth. And so, she continued to dig, following a trail of clues that led her deeper and deeper into the heart of Julian's corruption. As the investigation continued, the stakes grew higher. Julian's empire began to crumble, and the once powerful judge found himself facing the very real possibility of prison. The question on everyone's mind was, would Julian be brought to justice, or would he manage to wriggle free once again? The answer would have to wait. For now, the game was afoot, and Sarah was closing in on her prey. The fall of Julian St. Clair had begun, and nothing would ever be the same again. As Sarah delved deeper into the investigation, she began to uncover a complex web of deceit and corruption that went far beyond just Julian. It seemed that he was just the tip of the iceberg, and that there were many others involved in the corrupt scheme. One night, as Sarah was poring over documents and evidence in her small office, she received a mysterious phone call. The voice on the other end was distorted and unfamiliar, but the message was clear. Back off the investigation, or you'll regret it. Sarah was shaken, but she refused to give up. She knew that she was getting close to the truth, and she was determined to see it through. She reported the threatening phone call to the police, but they seemed skeptical and uninterested. Undeterred, Sarah continued her investigation. She spent long hours interviewing witnesses, analyzing documents, and following leads. And then finally she got her big break. A former associate of Julian's came forward, willing to testify against him in exchange for immunity. The associate, a nervous and fidgety man named Alex, told Sarah that Julian had been involved in a massive bribery scheme, taking millions of dollars in exchange for favorable rulings. Sarah was ecstatic. She knew that she had finally gathered enough evidence to bring Julian to justice. She took the evidence to the district attorney, who agreed to press charges. Julian was arrested and charged with bribery and corruption. As he was led away in handcuffs, Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction and vindication. She had fought hard to bring him to justice, and it had finally paid off. But as Julian's trial approached, Sarah began to realize that the case was not as clear-cut as she had thought. Julian's lawyers were formidable and well-prepared, and they raised doubts about the credibility of Sarah's witnesses. As the trial wore on, Sarah began to feel a sense of unease. Had she been too hasty in her judgment of Julian? Was he truly guilty, or had she simply been blinded by her desire for justice? The jury delivered its verdict, and Sarah's world was turned upside down. Julian was found guilty, but the sentence was not what Sarah had expected. The judge handed down a surprisingly lenient sentence, and Julian was given a mere slap on the wrist. Sarah was outraged. She had fought so hard to bring Julian to justice, and now it seemed that he was getting off scot-free. She began to wonder if the entire system was corrupt, and if she had simply been a pawn in a much larger game. As she left the courtroom, Sarah was approached by a mysterious figure. It was Alex, the former associate who had testified against Julian. "I'm sorry it didn't turn out the way you wanted," Alex said, his eyes gleaming with a knowing intensity. "But the truth is, Julian was just a small part of a much larger conspiracy, and I'm willing to tell you all about it." Sarah's eyes widened as she realized the implications. The case was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. As Sarah listened to Alex's words, she felt a shiver run down her spine. What did he mean by a larger conspiracy? And what did Julian's case have to do with it? "Tell me more," Sarah urged, her curiosity piqued. Alex glanced nervously around the courtroom, as if he feared being overheard. "I'll tell you everything," he promised. "But you have to promise me one thing." "What's that?" Sarah asked. "You have to promise me you'll protect yourself," Alex said, his voice low and serious. "These people are powerful, Sarah. They'll stop at nothing to keep their secrets safe." Sarah nodded, her heart racing with anticipation. "I promise," she said. "Now tell me what you know." Alex took a deep breath and began to speak, his words spilling out in a rush. "It starts with Julian's connections to the city's elite," he explained. "He was part of a secret network of powerful individuals who controlled the city from behind the scenes." Sarah's eyes widened as she listened. "What kind of network?" she asked. Alex hesitated, as if he feared saying too much. "A network of corrupt officials, business leaders and politicians," he said finally. "They worked together to line their own pockets and maintain their grip on power." Sarah felt a wave of outrage wash over her. "That's unbelievable," she said. Alex nodded. "I know it sounds crazy," he said, "but I've seen it with my own eyes. And I have proof." Sarah's eyes locked onto Alex's. "What kind of proof?" she asked. Alex smiled a small enigmatic smile. "I have documents, recordings, and witnesses," he said. "Enough to bring the entire network crashing down." Sarah's heart was racing now. "Let's get it out there," she said. "Let's expose them." Alex nodded, a look of determination on his face. "Together we can bring them down," he said. But as they shook hands, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were in over their heads. The network they were up against was powerful, ruthless, and willing to do whatever it took to maintain their grip on power. Had Sarah and Alex just made a fatal mistake? As Sarah and Alex began to gather evidence and build their case against the corrupt network, they knew they had to be careful. They were taking on some of the most powerful people in the city, and they knew that those people would stop at nothing to silence them. One night, as Sarah was working late in her office, she received a mysterious package. Inside, she found a cryptic message that read, "Drop the investigation, or you'll pay the price." Sarah was shaken, but she refused to back down. She knew that she was getting close to the truth, and she was determined to see it through. The next day, Sarah and Alex met with a whistleblower who had come forward with damning evidence against the network. The whistleblower, a nervous and fidgety man named Jack, told them that he had been a part of the network for years, but had finally decided to come clean. "I couldn't take it anymore," Jack said, his voice shaking. "I saw the damage that they were causing, and I knew that I had to do something." Sarah and Alex listened intently as Jack told them about the network's inner workings. They learned about the bribes, the kickbacks, and the threats that had been used to silence anyone who dared to speak out. As they left the meeting with Jack, Sarah and Alex knew that they had enough evidence to take down the network. But they also knew that they were in grave danger. "We need to get this evidence to the authorities," Sarah said, her voice low and urgent. "We need to make sure that these people are held accountable." Alex nodded in agreement. "But we can't do it alone," he said. "We need to find someone we can trust." Sarah thought for a moment. "I think I know just the person," she said. And with that, they set out to find the one person who could help them bring down the corrupt network once and for all. As Sarah and Alex navigated the treacherous landscape of corruption and deceit, they knew they had to tread carefully. One misstep could mean disaster. That's why they decided to reach out to Rachel Jenkins, a seasoned investigative journalist with a reputation for fearlessness. Rachel listened intently as Sarah and Alex laid out their evidence. Her eyes widened as she realized the scope of the corruption. "This is huge," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're talking about some of the most powerful people in the city." Sarah nodded. "We know," she said. "But we can't just sit back and do nothing." Rachel smiled, a fierce glint in her eye. "Don't worry," she said. "We'll take them down." Together, the trio began to build a case against the corrupt network. They worked tirelessly, poring over documents and conducting interviews. But the closer they got to the truth, the more they realized that they were in grave danger. The network would stop at nothing to silence them. One night, as Sarah was leaving Rachel's office, she noticed a suspicious figure lurking in the shadows. She quickened her pace, but the figure kept pace with her. Suddenly, a hand reached out and grabbed her arm. Sarah spun around, ready to fight. But to her surprise, the figure was none other than Julian St. Clair, the corrupt judge she had been investigating. "You're getting close to the truth," Julian sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. "But you'll never take me down." Sarah smiled, a fierce determination burning within her. "We'll see about that," she said. And with that, the battle between Sarah and the corrupt network reached its boiling point. As the battle between Sarah and the corrupt network reached its boiling point, Sarah knew she had to act fast. She gathered all the evidence she had collected and took it to the authorities. The authorities were shocked by the scope of the corruption, and they quickly sprang into action. Julian and his cohorts were arrested and charged with corruption and abuse of power. As the news of the arrest spread, the city erupted in cheers. The people had finally been vindicated, and justice had been served. Sarah, Alex, and Rachel were hailed as heroes for their bravery and determination. They had taken on the corrupt elite and won. As Sarah looked out over the city, she knew that she had made a difference. She had stood up for what was right, even in the face of danger and adversity. And as she walked away from the chaos, she knew that she would always stand up for justice, no matter the cost. The city would never be the same again, thanks to Sarah's courage and determination. The corrupt network had been brought to justice, and the people had been given a new sense of hope. As Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of pride and satisfaction, she knew that this was just the beginning. There were still many more battles to be fought, and she was ready to take them on.